Okay, good morning, folks. Uh, Happy to be participating in this very well organized, very thoughtful occasion. I'd rather we were all together doing it, but that's the way it is these days. Um, I see typos on my presentation, which aren't on the copy I have. That's all right. Next slide, please. So, about 2 years ago now, a book called Ronald Reagan and the Space Frontier was published by Paul Grave. It was the third in the series I've done on presidential decisions with respect to the space program. And there are several chapters in that book that pay particular attention to Mr. Reagan and the Reagan administration and space commercialization. So that's the source for what I'm going to say this morning. There's a lot more detail, obviously, in the book than I can include in 15 minutes, which is a commercial to buy the book. Next slide. Well, fundamentally, Ronald Reagan believed in the free enterprise system. And he brought a set of core beliefs to the White House, one of which that was the efficacy of the free enterprise system. Reagan's decision-making is rather interesting. I'm going to read from the book one quote from one of his longtime associates talking about how Reagan made decisions. He said, Marty Anderson, said he made decisions like an ancient king or a Turkish pasha, passively letting his subjects serve him. Rarely did he ask searching questions. He just sat back in a supremely calm, relaxed manner and waited until important things were brought to him. And then he would act quickly, decisively, and usually very wisely. So when you talk about Reagan and space, you have to talk about the people that brought the issues to him and the kind of tumult and fighting internal to the Reagan administration. That was one of its hallmarks. Reagan became convinced that the free enterprise system could be extended into space. A number of the people that Scott just mentioned, people out of the L5, Southern California, libertarian frame of mind, came to work in the White House in these early years. And their first influence was in the initial Reagan Statement of National Space Policy, which was issued on the 4th of July, not coincidentally, or not accidentally, I guess I should say. I think it was the first time that the word commercial appeared in a Statement of National Space Policy. The United States encourages domestic commercial exploration of space. Didn't say exploitation, said exploration. And provide a climate conducive to expanded private sector investment and involvement. That foundation was laid very early on in the Reagan administration. Next slide. Where did this come from? Well, some of that has already been mentioned, particularly by Scott just now, that in the late 70s, the idea that there was money to be made by doing things through the private sector in space had the term space industrialization applied to it. One of the big proposals at that time was solar power satellites. I was involved back then in studies by NASA and the Department of Energy of the idea of capturing solar energy, transforming it into microwave and beaming it down to Earth. NASA was involved in this because it was looking for things to do after Apollo and after Shuttle and reasons to build a space station. So NASA was very much supportive of the idea of space industrialization. I guess as a side thing, one should note that commercialization in space was already very well established by the time Reagan arrived in Washington in the form of communication satellites. The domestic deregulation of communication satellites had happened under the Nixon administration. And so it was already a thriving business area, which we don't talk about very much when we talk about space commercialization, because it's really telecommunications more than space. There were some companies, particularly McDonnell Douglas, that were interested in broadening their business base and saw the idea of space commercialization, industrial activity in space, particularly taking advantage of the microgravity environment as an area for business expansion. Then there were, as Scott said, a bunch of people that got excited about being in space, about doing things in space. Some of them shared with the view of Reagan that government was not the solution, government was the problem. They were libertarians who said, get the government, in particular, get NASA out of the way, and we can make lots of money doing things in space. Alex McDonald talked about the individuals that have a lot of influence. I'll call out two here and a few more as we go along. There was a young 30-year-old former public relations executive that became, in the inner circle of the White House, the person that managed cabinet affairs, a young guy named Craig Fuller, very enthusiastic about space. And the son of the head of Grumman during the Apollo era, Llewellyn Evans, Bud Evans, was a kind of evangelist for commercial space in these early Reagan years. And particularly I think after 82, maybe 84, I think after 82, two young congressmen, Newt Gingrich and Bob Walker, became enthusiastic advocates for commercial space inside of the Congress. And there was a Commercial Space Act in 1984, sponsored by Mr. Walker. Next slide. This message got to Ronald Reagan in several different ways, through these people around him, through what NASA was telling him, and then Fuller and Evans arranged a lunch, August the 3rd, 1983, with Reagan and an interesting mixture of the heads of the heritage aerospace companies. Sitting to Mr. Reagan's left is John Yardley at McDonnell Douglas, then Jim Beggs, then George Jeffs, Scott's old boss at Rockwell. The person with his head to the rear is Dave Thompson, just then starting orbital sciences. And way down at the end of the table is a man named Klaus Heitz, who was a conservative economist and advocate for the commercial opportunities in space. Reagan heard then about all the things that could be done in space that would produce profit, mainly in the context of advocacy for NASA's proposal for a space station, which was on the agenda at that point in time. Next slide. What were the areas that were being discussed? Observing the Earth from space, I'm going to let Brian Giroux talk about that. Commercializing launch vehicles, and materials processing in microgravity were the areas, plus advanced communication. I don't think I need to go through the specifics of the bullets there. As Dave Thompson and his colleagues started orbital sciences, they had to pick a product, and they picked an upper stage for the shuttle. Probably regretted the mistake of depending on the shuttle for their business success, and they were able to adapt out of that. Next slide. And this is a kind of projections that were being bandied about at this time period. The quotes Alan Greenspan about irrational enthusiasm in the stock market, but it certainly applies here. And you can see where materials processing and in particular was seen as a remarkable business opportunity. Well, didn't happen, but that's another story. Next slide. The government explicitly said it was not going to buy ELVs any longer. All government payloads would be launched on the shuttle. And that meant for the manufacturers of Deltas, Atlas, and Titan, they either commercialized them or shut down the production lines. And they, 2 out of the 3, General Dynamics and, what was it by that time? Just Martin Marietta, that decided to try to commercialize the Atlas and the Titan. The head of the Delta program, David Grimes, tried to commercialize it. And then there were the small companies that said, hey, let's build a small rocket. There was a fight, a rather nasty fight, between commerce and transportation over who would promote and regulate commercial launch. Malcolm Baldrige, Secretary of Commerce, Elizabeth Dole, Secretary of Transportation, both saw an opportunity to expand their bureaucracies. Reagan was convinced to give the lead to DOT, but I think the lasting impact of this fight was it meant that space policy was no longer the monopoly just of NASA. And those companies and their representatives, people like Bob Brumley and Courtney Stead for Commerce, Jenna Dorn for Transportation, became very active in the space policy debates for the remainder of the Reagan administration. Shuttle pricing was the first battleground. And as Scott mentioned, on one side, it was the shuttle versus Ariane. And the shuttle said, well, Ariane can fly people to South America on the Concorde, but if you come with us with your commercial payload, we'll fly you into space. And actually 2 people did that before the shuttle was taken out of the commercial launch business after the Challenger accident. It was a slow business to evolve. The first licensed launch was only in 1989, but the foundation for a commercial launch business was laid then. Next slide. What NASA wanted was to build the space station. And as one part of that advocacy, talked about the possible commercial activities on the station, on long-duration microgravity. There were a series of policy initiatives, flying Charlie Walker with an electrophoresis experiment on the shuttle, and then Max Faget, coming out of NASA, proposed a so-called industrial space facility as a human-tended alternative or maybe complement to NASA's space station. There was, again, a pretty nasty fight of seeing ISF as a threat to the station. There was an Office of Commercial Programs headed by a man named Ike Gillum that put out a very long commercial space policy from NASA. Then came Challenger, and all of that came to a kind of a grinding halt. The interest persisted, but there was no platform until the station would be available. Then the mid-1990s, again, it didn't happen for quite a while. But the commercial interest, there was a new set of initiatives announced in February 1988 of things the government should do to facilitate the commercial section. So next slide. what is the legacy of the Reagan administration? Well, first of all, it was not based on facts. It was based on ideology. I go back and read that what I wrote in 1984 was fairly prescient. Well, my time frame wasn't quite right, but at least to some of us, the idea that these commercial profits were just around the corner, which is what Reagan was being told, was an illusion. Before that, the cupboard will be almost bare. But the policy incentives that were developed in the 80s, the public-private partnerships, buying services rather than hardware, the government positive regulations to create a business climate, provided the foundation for commercial space activities. And so that's what I think you can identify as Reagan's space legacy with respect to commercial space. And that's it.